Thorin was a name that made grown soldiers lower their eyes. He ruled Blackthorn Keep the way winter rules a mountain, total, silent, without apology. 5 wars had passed through his hands and left him standing, while lesser men were carried out on shields. 3 assassins had tried for his throat and failed, and one of them, it was said, he had killed with nothing but the candlestick from his own desk. But it wasn't the wars that made people whisper about him in the kitchens and the stables. It was the other thing, the colder thing. No woman had ever gotten close to him, not close in the way court ladies meant when they smiled behind their fans and called him unattainable, as if that word made him more delicious, like a locked box everyone wanted to pry open just to prove they could. Not close in the way his advisors meant when they muttered about heirs and bloodlines and the future of the keep. Close in the plain, human way, the way where someone simply sits beside another person and neither one is performing anything. Women had tried, beautiful ones, clever ones. Daughters of dukes who could recite poetry in 3 languages, and warrior women who could outride his own cavalry. He was polite to all of them, in the same flat, unreachable way a mountain is polite to the wind. He let them talk. He let them leave. Nothing about him ever bent. The staff had a joke about it, the kind of joke that isn't really funny, more like something people say, so the strangeness of a thing feels smaller. They said the Alpha King's heart wasn't broken. Broken hearts could still ache, still remember, still, on a bad night, want something. His wasn't like that. His was locked. Not damaged, designed. Built that way on purpose, they guessed, though nobody knew the purpose and nobody dared ask him directly. Wren didn't know any of that gossip when she first came to work at Blackthorn Keep. Or rather, she knew it the way you know weather reports for a country you've never visited. Distant. Not her concern. Her concern was much smaller and much more urgent. Don't be noticed. Don't be blamed. Don't be sent away. She had learned that lesson early, the hard way, the way children learn things when there's no one gentle around to teach them softly instead. Her parents had died when she was young enough that most of her memories of them were more like feelings than pictures. A smell of bread, a voice humming something low, warm hands that don't exist anymore except as an ache she can't quite place. After that came 3 years of being passed between relatives who didn't want another mouth at their table, and after that came 2 years where there wasn't even a relative to be unwanted by. Just streets. Just the kind of hunger that teaches your whole body to move quietly, to take up less space, to become the kind of person nobody looks at twice, because being looked at twice, in that life, usually meant being looked at by someone dangerous. By the time the keep took her in, not out of any grand kindness, just because they needed hands and she had 2 of them and was willing to work, she had already perfected the art of disappearing while still standing in the room. She scrubbed floors, she folded linens, she carried water up staircases that seemed built to punish knees. She said, "Yes, my lord," and "Of course, my lady," and otherwise kept her eyes down and her voice smaller than a whisper. She had never once, in all her years there, expected the Alpha King to know her name. The night everything changed started like any other night that had gone slightly wrong. She had been folding linens in his private study, a room she wasn't technically supposed to be in that late, but the head housekeeper had been short-staffed, and Wren had said she'd finish it, because saying yes to extra work was another one of those quiet girl survival skills. Better to be useful than to be noticed for the wrong reasons. The fire in his study was the kind of fire that makes a room feel like it's holding its breath for you. Orange light moving slow across the stone walls. The kind of warmth her body had never learned to say no to, because for 2 years on the street, warmth had been rarer than food. She told herself she'd fold 1 more stack and then leave. She was still telling herself that when the door opened harder than doors are supposed to open, and the king came in like a man made of old bruises, blood soaking through the shoulder of his coat, breathing like every breath cost him something. She should have left immediately. That was the rule, unspoken but absolute. When the king enters a room, the staff exits it, quickly, quietly, like water finding the nearest drain. She didn't move. Later she would try to explain this to herself and fail every time. Maybe it was that he looked, for just a second, less like a king and more like a person who had been awake for 3 days and was one bad thought away from falling down. Maybe it was that nobody had ever taught her what to do when the most powerful man in the province looked, briefly, breakable. He dropped into the chair by the fire like something felled, not sat, dropped, the way a tree drops when the last cut goes through. He didn't order her out. She meant to leave. She really did mean to. But her feet had apparently made a different decision than her brain, because the next thing she knew she was crossing the room toward him instead of away from him, and she was kneeling at his side, and she was reaching for the wound at his collarbone with hands that had no business touching a king's skin without permission. "My lord, this needs cleaning," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her. He didn't answer. He didn't tell her to stop either. His eyes were closed, and his jaw was tight, the way a person's jaw goes tight when they're holding something in that they refuse to let out in front of another human being. She worked in silence. She'd learned basic wound care the hard way too, on herself, mostly, back when there was no one else to do it. Clean the edges. Press firm. Don't flinch even when your hands are shaking, because flinching makes the patient flinch, and a flinching patient bleeds more. She stitched the worst of it with a needle she found in the sewing kit she always carried, the same one she used to mend her own worn hems. 3 stitches. 4. He made no sound. Somewhere around the 5th stitch, his breathing slowed from ragged to something almost peaceful, like a held breath finally being let out in small pieces instead of all at once. She didn't notice her own eyes growing heavy until they had already closed. She didn't notice her head tipping sideways until it had already found the solid warmth of his chest. She was asleep before her mind caught up to what her body had just done, before some panicked corner of her thoughts could scream, "This is the king. Get up, get up, get up." By the time that thought did arrive, it was already too late. She was gone, fully, completely asleep, in the arms, or rather, against the chest, of the most feared man in 5 provinces. He went rigid. Every instinct he had, sharpened over 3 wars and countless nights where trusting the wrong shadow meant dying in it, screamed at him to move her away, to call for someone, to treat this the way he treated every unplanned thing, as a threat to be neutralized, quickly, cleanly, before it could become a liability. He didn't move her. His hand rose instead, slow, like it belonged to someone else, someone braver than he usually let himself be, and it found the crown of her head. Just to check, he told himself, just to confirm she was real, and not some trick of exhaustion and blood loss playing games with his vision. She stirred at the touch, murmured something that wasn't quite a word, the soft, formless sound of someone deep enough in sleep that the outside world only reaches them as texture, not meaning. And then she burrowed closer, chasing the warmth of him the way a person chases warmth, when their whole life has taught them that warmth doesn't come often enough to waste. He didn't move again until morning, not once. Not to shift his weight, not to call a guard, not to do any of the 100 things a king with a fresh battle wound is supposed to do. He sat there through the night with a sleeping maid, using his ribs as a pillow, and something in his chest that had been locked for longer than she'd been alive creaked open by exactly 1 degree. He would never admit, not even to himself in the honest dark of that room, how badly he had needed someone to simply not be afraid of him for 1 single night. She woke to gray morning light coming through the tall windows, and to the slow, horrifying realization of exactly where her face had spent the last several hours. My lord. She was already scrambling backward, already halfway into an apology, already mentally listing the 17 different ways this could end with her being dismissed before breakfast, sleeping on the king, touching the king without invitation, falling asleep in his private study when she wasn't even supposed to be there past dusk. Any one of those, alone, could have been enough. Stay. 1 word. Low, rough with sleep. And something else she didn't have a name for yet. Not a command in the way his commands usually landed. Those had edges, weight, the kind of finality that made rooms go quiet. This one had none of that. This one sounded almost like a question wearing a command's clothes. She stayed. Word travels fast in a place like Blackthorn Keep, faster than any rider, faster than any letter. By the time the breakfast bells rang, half the staff already knew. The maid, the Alpha King's chest, all night. The details grew with each retelling, the way details always do when they pass through enough mouths. Some said she'd been found curled in his lap, others swore she'd been discovered wrapped in his own coat, others still whispered that the king himself had carried her to bed afterward like something precious. None of it was quite true. All of it, somehow, carried a grain of the real thing underneath the exaggeration. The other women on staff did not take it kindly. Wren didn't blame them, not really. She understood, in the quiet part of her mind that had learned to understand almost everyone's cruelty as a form of self-protection, that they weren't hating her out of nothing. They were hating her because she had, without meaning to, without asking for it, stumbled into something they had spent years trying and failing to reach. Some had brought him tea for months hoping he'd notice their hands. Some had lingered in hallways at hours they had no real business lingering in, hoping. And here was Wren, quiet, unremarkable, invisible Wren, who had simply fallen asleep and woken up chosen. It didn't feel like being chosen, not at first. It felt like being caught in something too large for her, like a small boat suddenly finding itself in open water it had never trained for. He found reasons to see her, in the days that followed, not grand reasons, small, almost embarrassing ones, the kind a king shouldn't need to invent, given that he could simply summon anyone he wanted for any reason at all, and no one would question it. His shirts, he said, needed mending, though nothing about them was torn. His tea needed bringing personally, though he had a boy whose entire job was exactly that. He wanted her opinion on a matter of the kitchen accounts, though he had never once in his life asked a maid's opinion on anything before her. She let herself want it. Just a little, just enough to be dangerous, the way a small flame is dangerous to a house that's mostly kindling. Because girls who grew up the way she grew up learn one lesson better than any other lesson life has to offer. Don't reach for the things you can't afford to lose. Wanting is expensive. Wanting the wrong thing, wanting a king, of all impossible things, could cost more than she had left to spend. She reached anyway. It started small. A conversation that ran longer than it needed to. A silence between them that wasn't uncomfortable, which surprised her more than anything else about him, because she had assumed silence around powerful men was always the kind that made your skin crawl, always the kind where you were waiting for the next blow, verbal or otherwise. His silences were different. His silences felt like rooms with the windows open. He asked her, one evening, why she never looked people in the eye when she spoke to them. She almost lied. The old habit rose up fast, the automatic "I don't know, my lord," that would have ended the conversation and kept her safely small. But something about the way he'd asked, not as an accusation, just as an honest question from someone who genuinely wanted to know, made the truth slip out instead. Looking at people, she said, used to get me noticed. Getting noticed used to get me hurt. He didn't say anything for a long moment. When he did speak, his voice had gone quieter than she'd heard it before. Who hurt you? It wasn't a question. It was closer to a promise. She shook her head, because that story had more rooms in it than she was ready to open for anyone, let alone for him, let alone this soon. It doesn't matter anymore. It matters to me. 2 sentences. That was all he gave her that night. But something about the plainness of it. No poetry, no performance, just a man saying a true thing because it was true, settled into her chest, and stayed there long after she'd left the room. The trouble, when it came from exactly the direction she'd expected it to. A nobleman, one of the king's own advisors, a man who had spent years angling his own daughter toward the throne, brought the matter up at a council gathering of all places, as if it were a subject fit for state business. He spoke of the king's reputation. He spoke of weakness, and of what it meant for a ruler to be seen softening over a servant girl with no name and no family and no claim to anything but a mop and a set of tired hands. He used the word unfit. He used the word disgrace. Wren wasn't in the room when it happened. She heard about it afterward, the way she heard about everything, second-hand, through the careful whispers of staff who liked her enough now to want her warned. They told her the king hadn't raised his voice. He never did. That wasn't his way. He had simply looked at the nobleman the way he looked at enemy formations before he ended them, and had said, in a voice so calm it apparently made the whole room go colder than the actual temperature would explain, "She stays. That is not a matter open for discussion." The nobleman, they said, left considerably paler than he'd arrived. When Wren heard the story, she found an empty corridor, pressed her palm flat against her own chest, and stood there a long while, as if she could hold the feeling inside her ribs by force alone. She had been protected before, in a manner of speaking, fed, sheltered, given a bed and a task, and told, in the coldest practical terms, that she was useful enough to be kept alive. She had never, not once in her whole remembered life, been chosen. Not like that. Not with a man risking the anger of his own council over the simple fact of her staying in the same building as him. It undid something in her that she hadn't known was still tied shut. That same night, she found him in the kitchens, an unusual place for a king to be, standing awkwardly among sacks of flour and hanging pots, looking entirely out of place and not seeming to care. This time there was no invented excuse dressed up as a task, no shirts, no tea. He simply stood in the doorway and looked at her, the way a person looks at the last warm light left in a cold house. "I don't know how to do this," he said. 5 wars survived, 3 assassins outlived, a council full of powerful men made pale with a single sentence. And that admission was the one that visibly cost him something to say. "Neither do I," she answered, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to, more honest than she'd planned. "I've only ever known how to disappear. Don't." One word again. It was becoming, she realized, the whole shape of his language with her. Not eloquent, not poetic. Just single true words, offered plainly, without decoration, because decoration had never been something he trusted, and she had never had the luxury of learning to trust either. She crossed the kitchen floor without waiting for permission this time. She had spent her whole life waiting for permission to want things, to need things, to take up space in a room. She was done waiting for it now. His arms came around her like they had been holding that exact position in reserve for years, just waiting for someone small enough, and brave enough, and tired enough of hiding, to finally step into them. Neither of them said anything else that night. There wasn't anything else that needed saying. Some things, once they've been said honestly enough, don't require repeating. In the weeks that followed, the whispers around Blackthorn Keep changed shape, the way whispers do once the thing they're whispering about stops being a scandal and starts being simply true. The staff stopped calling her the maid who slept on the king. They started calling her, half joking and half in awe, the one who found the key, because that was what it had started to look like, from the outside. As if the king's heart really had been a locked door all along, exactly as the old rumor said, and it had simply been waiting, all those cold years, for someone who wasn't trying to pick the lock at all, someone who'd only ever wanted a warm place to rest her head for one night, and had ended up, entirely by accident, finding the one place in the whole keep that had never let anyone else in. Once she'd found it, he never let her put it down again. That, in the end, was the whole story people told about them for years afterward. Not a tale of grand rescue or dramatic declaration, but something quieter and, in its own way, harder won. A girl who had spent her life learning to take up as little space as possible, and a king who had spent his learning to let no one close enough to matter, finding in each other the one thing neither of them had thought they were allowed to have. Not a performance of love, not a display for the court or the council, or the watching eyes of a kingdom that loved a good story. Just 2 exhausted people, choosing, on an ordinary cold night, to stop being afraid of each other,